There are cars so extreme that history barely acknowledges them. Machines built without restraint, released into a world that wasn't ready, and then banned so quickly they became legends overnight. Too dangerous to defend and too embarrassing to remember, they were erased almost as soon as they appeared. These are the super banned cars you won't believe were ever real.
The early-day Tomaso Pantera sold in the United States sits right on the edge between legend and catastrophe, a car whose reputation for rawness and danger is not romantic exaggeration, but a direct reflection of how close it came to regulatory extinction. The Pantera was never meant to be polite. It was conceived as an Italian exotic with American muscle, a mid-engine supercar powered by a huge Ford V8 and sold through Lincoln Mercury dealers to buyers who had never owned anything remotely like it. That collision of ambition, haste, and industrial mismatch nearly killed the project outright. From its U.S. debut in 1971, the Pantera was a study in contradictions. On one hand, it offered performance that rivaled far more expensive European exotics. On the other, it was assembled with shockingly inconsistent quality control. Cars left the factory with misrouted cables, poorly secured components, uneven welds, and cooling systems that were barely adequate even under ideal conditions. In American traffic, especially in hot climates, those weaknesses became dangerous rather than merely inconvenient. The most infamous issue was throttle control. Early Panteras used cable routing that was susceptible to binding, fraying, and heat deformation. There were documented cases where the throttle stuck partially or fully open, not because of driver error, but because the cable physically jammed. In a mid-engine car with a large V8 and limited braking margin, this was terrifying. Drivers described situations where lifting off the pedal did nothing, forcing them to kill the ignition or stand on fading brakes while the car continued to accelerate. These were not isolated anecdotes, they were patterns. Braking itself was another critical weak point. The Pantera was fast, heavy by mid-engine standards, and capable of sustained high speeds, yet the braking system was marginal, even new. Under repeated use, especially spirited driving, brake fade arrived suddenly. Pedal field changed mid-corner. Stopping distances increased unpredictably. In combination with throttle issues, this created scenarios where drivers were simultaneously unable to slow and unable to modulate power, a nightmare combination that regulators take very seriously. Cooling failures were equally severe. The Pantera's cooling system struggled in stop-and-go traffic, a fatal flaw in the U.S. market where urban congestion was unavoidable. Overheating was not a rare occurrence, but an expectation. Engines ran hot, radiators struggled to dissipate heat, and fans were insufficient. In extreme cases, engines shut down in traffic or boiled over, creating safety hazards well beyond mechanical inconvenience. A stalled supercar in traffic is one thing. A stalled supercar leaking coolant and oil on a busy roadway is another. Perhaps most unsettling was chassis behavior. The Pantera's structure lacked the rigidity expected of a mid-engine performance car. Under load, especially on uneven pavement or during aggressive cornering, chassis flex altered suspension geometry in real time. Drivers reported that the car's balance could change mid-corner without warning, transitioning from neutral to oversteer abruptly. This was not the sharp but predictable behavior of a race-bred car. It felt alive in the wrong way, as if the car were arguing with itself about what it wanted to do. These issues did not escape the attention of U.S. regulators. As complaints, accident reports, and warranty claims accumulated, scrutiny increased. Approval was not revoked immediately, but the threat was real. Regulators made it clear that continued sale in the U.S. market depended on meaningful corrective action. This was not about refinement or comfort, it was about basic operational safety. Under pressure, Tomaso and its partners moved quickly, though quietly. Early cars were removed from sale or held back. Others were retrofitted, sometimes at dealers, sometimes after delivery, with revised throttle linkages, improved cooling components, reinforced chassis sections, and braking upgrades. These changes were not advertised. They were not framed as recalls in the modern sense. They were survival measures. What makes the Pantera's story especially revealing is how carefully it was managed afterward. Tomaso never acknowledged how close the car came to being barred from the U.S. market. Marketing emphasized performance, styling, and exotic appeal, not the frantic behind-the-scenes effort to make the car legally and practically tolerable. Later Panteras were genuinely better machines, but the gulf between early and later cars was enormous, far greater than the public was ever allowed to understand. Owners of early Panteras often describe a sense of betrayal mixed with awe. The car was thrilling, beautiful, and brutally fast, but also unpredictable and occasionally frightening. Many learned its limits the hard way. Some cars were modified extensively by owners simply to make them trustworthy. Others were sold quickly once the honeymoon ended. A surprising number disappeared early, written off, wrecked, or sidelined by unresolved issues. In this sense, the Pantera fits perfectly into the category of cars that were never officially banned, yet were allowed to survive only because enough changes were made just in time. It was not outlawed by name, but it was placed under a regulatory microscope that could have ended it overnight. Tomaso survived by doing the minimum necessary to remain legal and by ensuring that the full extent of the early problems never entered the mainstream narrative. Today, the Pantera is often remembered as raw, wild, and uncompromising. That reputation is deserved, but it is incomplete. It was also a car that exposed the limits of selling race-level performance without race-level discipline in engineering and quality control. The early U.S. spec Panteras were not just rough around the edges, they were flirting with illegality through danger. The reason the Pantera still exists in legend rather than as a cautionary footnote is because it was rescued at the last possible moment. And like many cars in that narrow category, its survival depends on selective memory. The fixes are remembered, the near ban is not.
The early civilian Mini Moke is one of the clearest examples of a vehicle that survived only because governments chose to stop taking it seriously. It was not refined, corrected, or redeemed. It was simply reclassified in spirit, if not always on paper, from car to something closer to a curiosity. That quiet downgrade is the only reason it avoided outright extinction. The Moke's origins already sealed its fate. Conceived in the late 1950s as a light military utility vehicle based on the Mini, it was meant to be cheap, air-transportable, and simple. On the drawing board, it looked clever. In reality, it failed almost immediately. The Mini's tiny wheels, low ground clearance, and front-wheel drive layout made it useless off-road. During British Army trials, the Moke proved incapable of traversing rough terrain, bogged down easily, and offered no protection to occupants. The military rejected it decisively. Instead of killing the project, British Motor Corporation pushed it into civilian production almost by inertia. There was no real de-resign, no attempt to make it safe or structurally competent for public roads. What civilians received was essentially a stripped military prototype: flat panels, no doors, no roof, minimal lighting, no side protection, no meaningful frontal structure, and seats bolted to a thin monocoque with almost nothing between occupants and the outside world. From the moment regulators encountered it, alarm bells rang. In any conventional collision scenario, the Moke offered virtually zero protection. Frontal impacts meant the occupants were the crumple zone. Side impacts meant direct contact with whatever struck the car. Rollovers were especially dangerous because there was no roof structure, no rollover protection, and no restraint geometry designed to keep occupants inside the vehicle. Ejection was not a risk, it was the expected outcome. Stability was another problem. The Moke's wide stance relative to its wheel size gave it decent low-speed balance, but at higher speeds it became nervous and unpredictable. Crosswinds affected it dramatically.
Emergency maneuvers revealed just how compromised the chassis was once load transfer exceeded modest limits. This was not a car designed to coexist with modern traffic, even by 1960 standards. Several countries recognized this immediately and refused to register it outright. In parts of continental Europe and other export markets, the Moke simply could not be approved as a passenger vehicle. It failed basic requirements for occupant protection. Where it was allowed, it often came with extreme restrictions, limits on maximum speed, limits on passenger count, limits on where it could be driven. In some cases, it was classified in special categories closer to utility equipment or recreational vehicles than automobiles. Even in the UK and other permissive markets, the attitude toward the Moke was revealing. Authorities tolerated it rather than endorsed it. Enforcement treated it differently. Expectations were lowered. The unspoken assumption was that anyone driving a Moke understood they were accepting risks that no normal car buyer would accept. That assumption allowed regulators to step back without formally banning it. British Leyland's silence is telling. Unlike with other controversial vehicles, there was no serious defense of the Moke's safety, no engineering arguments, no claims of misunderstood innovation. The company marketed it as fun, carefree, and unconventional, never as safe or robust. That was not an oversight, it was an admission by omission. There was no defensible safety case to make. Crash performance data, where available, confirmed what common sense already suggested. In collisions that would be survivable in ordinary small cars, Moke occupants suffered severe injuries or worse. The flat body panels offered no energy absorption. Steering components were rigid and intrusive. Seat belts, when fitted, often anchored to thin sheet metal. The car behaved less like a passenger vehicle and more like a motorized platform. What ultimately saved the Moke was not improvement, but recontextualization. Governments and buyers alike began to treat it as a novelty, a beach car, a resort shuttle, a farm runabout, something driven slowly in controlled environments away from heavy traffic. In those roles, its dangers were still present, but exposure was reduced. The Moke survived by being gently pushed out of serious use. This is why its production history is so fragmented. Manufacturing shifted between countries. Specifications varied wildly. Some versions gained minor safety additions, but none ever approached modern standards or even the standards of their own era. The core problem was structural and conceptual. Fixing it would have required turning the Moke into a completely different vehicle. In historical terms, the Moke belongs in the category of cars that were never officially condemned, because condemning them would have required admitting they never should have existed. Instead, regulators chose a quieter path: refuse it where necessary, restrict it where possible, ignore it where convenient, let it exist on the margins. Today, the Mini Moke is remembered fondly as charming, quirky, and fun. That memory is selective. It survives because it is no longer asked to function as real transportation. When viewed through the lens of safety and regulation, the early civilian Mini Moke was not misunderstood. It was understood perfectly well. It was simply tolerated as a toy. British Leyland never defended it seriously because there was nothing to defend. The Moke was not a failed car that deserved another chance. It was a vehicle that only remained legal because the world quietly agreed not to treat it like a car at all. The early rally homologation Alpine A110 sits in that uncomfortable space where motorsport brilliance crossed a line that public roads could not tolerate. These cars were not flawed in the usual sense. They did exactly what they were designed to do. The problem was that what made them devastatingly effective on mountain stages made them fundamentally incompatible with ordinary traffic, ordinary drivers, and ordinary mistakes. At its core, the early A110 was a racing car wearing just enough legality to exist outside special stages. Alpine's obsession with weight was absolute. The fiberglass body was astonishingly thin, more shell than structure, mounted over a lightweight backbone chassis that offered precision but almost no energy absorption. There were no meaningful crumple zones, no side impact protection, and very little between occupants and the outside world. In a crash, the car did not manage energy, it simply failed. The engine placement defined everything. With a rear-mounted engine sitting well behind the axle, the A110 carried an extreme rear weight bias. In competition, this gave it immense traction on loose surfaces and extraordinary agility in tight mountain hairpins. On rally stages, driven by professionals who understood weight transfer instinctively, the car was magical. It rotated eagerly, clawed its way uphill, and could embarrass far more powerful machinery. On public roads, the same traits became lethal. The handling balance was not progressive, it was binary. At modest speeds, the car felt light, nimble, almost playful. Drivers unfamiliar with its dynamics were lulled into confidence. But once grip was exceeded, especially during liftoff or sudden steering inputs, snap oversteer arrived instantly. There was no warning phase, no gentle slide to catch. The rear swung around violently, and recovery required racing-level reflexes. Many drivers simply never had a chance. Braking only compounded the danger. The car was so light that brakes seemed adequate on paper, but repeated use on mountain descents revealed fade quickly. Combined with the rear weight bias, braking while cornering could destabilize the car instantly. A slight correction, a lifted throttle, or an unexpected surface change could turn a normal road bend into a catastrophic loss of control. Fatal accidents began to accumulate, particularly in mountainous regions where the A110's reputation encouraged enthusiastic driving. What made these crashes especially disturbing to authorities was not reckless behavior at extreme speeds, but the frequency of serious accidents at speeds that felt reasonable to drivers. The margin for error was simply too small. Unlike heavier sports cars that communicated their limits, the A110 crossed the threshold abruptly. Regulators took notice. Investigations concluded that certain early homologation configurations were effectively race cars masquerading as road vehicles. Minimal safety equipment, lack of structural protection, and extreme handling characteristics made them unsuitable for public use. Rather than banning the A110 name outright, authorities targeted specific configurations, quietly removing approval for the most aggressive versions. Owners were given limited options. Some cars were reclassified as competition-only vehicles. Others could remain registered only after modifications that dulled their original character. Many were simply taken off the road altogether. These decisions were not loudly publicized. There was no scandal, no press campaign. The cars just disappeared from civilian traffic. Alpine, for its part, said very little. Publicly, the company focused on its rally victories, on the A110's dominance in international competition, on the romance of Monte Carlo wins and mountain glory. Privately, it accepted the reality. The most extreme versions could not coexist with public roads. Alpine continued to evolve the car, gradually improving stability, safety, and predictability, but the earliest homologation monsters were left behind. This quiet erasure is part of why the legend of the A110 feels so clean today. The narrative emphasizes brilliance, lightness, and success, not the uncomfortable truth that some versions were simply too unforgiving to be allowed among normal drivers. The cars that survived into private hands are often the tamer ones, or those heavily modified to make them less hostile. What makes the story haunting is that the early A110 was not a cynical mistake. It was the pure expression of motorsport logic applied too literally. Alpine built exactly what it believed in: lightness above all, performance through simplicity, victory through precision. The public road was never the priority. Homologation was a formality, not a philosophical boundary. In the end, the most extreme A110s did not fail. They succeeded too completely. They exposed the limit where racing excellence becomes public danger. Rather than rewriting that history, Alpine allowed those cars to fade quietly into competition-only status, trophies of an era when the line between rally stage and public road was thinner than it ever should have been.
The lightweight Jaguar E-Type competition road hybrids represent one of the most carefully buried chapters in the car's otherwise romantic mythology. Today, the E-Type is remembered as a beautiful, fast, and civilized sports car, something that could be driven to the opera as easily as it could storm down a straight. That reputation only survives because a handful of early lightweight variants were quietly removed from civilian life before they could poison the legend. These cars were born from Jaguar's obsession with racing success in the early 1960s. The company was fresh from Le Mans' glory and believed, with some justification, that the fastest way to dominate was to adapt race technology directly to the road. The lightweight E-Types were not styling exercises or luxury statements. They were weapons. Thin aluminum panels replaced steel, often so thin they could be dented by hand pressure. Sound deadening was minimal or non-existent. Structural reinforcement was sacrificed wherever weight could be saved. What remained was a car that felt alive in a way few road cars ever have. The problem was that the engineering priorities were purely competitive. Safety was not merely secondary, it was almost irrelevant. The monocoque structure, already marginal by modern standards, became alarmingly fragile in lightweight form. Side impact protection was essentially non-existent. In a collision, the aluminum body offered little resistance, tearing rather than absorbing energy. There were no roll bars, no meaningful rollover protection, and no structural redundancy. At speed, a single failure could cascade into catastrophe. Fuel system design was particularly troubling. The fuel tanks were vulnerable, poorly shielded, and positioned in ways that made rupture during an impact disturbingly likely. In racing, this was an accepted risk, mitigated by professional drivers, controlled environments, and rapid emergency response. On public roads, it was indefensible. Several safety evaluations concluded that even relatively minor crashes could result in fuel leakage or fire, especially when combined with the car's heat-soaked exhaust routing. Braking exposed another fault line between track and road. Under light use, the brakes felt adequate, even impressive for their era. Under repeated hard applications, particularly on fast roads or mountain descents, fade arrived rapidly and unpredictably. Pedal feel changed without warning. Stopping distances increased dramatically just when drivers expected consistency. For a car capable of extremely high speeds, this was a lethal mismatch. On a circuit, drivers anticipated this behavior and managed it. On public roads, it caught people unprepared. Handling, too, demanded far more skill than Jaguar ever admitted publicly. The lightweight cars were sharper, faster to respond, and far less forgiving than standard E-Types. The rear suspension, already complex and sensitive, became twitchier as mass was removed. At the limit, the car could bite suddenly, especially on uneven or cambered roads. These were not traits suited to enthusiastic amateurs, yet these cars were nominally road legal. Regulators noticed. In several countries, safety evaluations raised immediate red flags. The cars failed to meet emerging standards not only in crashworthiness, but in durability and predictable behavior under repeated stress. Rather than issuing dramatic bans, authorities simply refused registration approval for certain configurations. Others allowed registration only if extensive modifications were made, modifications that effectively destroyed the car's lightweight purpose. Owners found themselves cornered. Some reclassified their cars as competition-only vehicles, removing them from public roads entirely. Others undertook quiet retrofits, adding reinforcements, altering fuel systems, upgrading brakes, and installing safety equipment that Jaguar never intended. A number of cars simply vanished into private collections, never registered, never driven legally, their existence acknowledged only in racing circles.
Jaguar never confronted this publicly. To do so would have risked contaminating the E-Type's image just as it was becoming a global icon. Instead, the company allowed the lightweight variants to fade into obscurity while promoting the standard production cars as the definitive E-Type experience. Press material focused on beauty, performance, and refinement, not on the uncomfortable truth that some E-Types were effectively race cars that regulators would not tolerate on public roads. This selective memory worked. The E-Type became immortalized as a balanced, usable supercar of its era. The dangerous extremes were forgotten, discussed only in hushed tones among historians and racers. When modern recreations of lightweight E-Types appear, they are often carefully sanitized, built to contemporary safety expectations while wearing the visual cues of the originals. What makes this story unsettling is not that Jaguar pushed boundaries. That was expected of a racing-driven company in that era. What is unsettling is how close these cars came to redefining the E-Type as something reckless rather than revolutionary. Had a few more of these lightweight hybrids remained on public roads, had a few more accidents reached public attention, the E-Type's legacy might look very different today. The myth survives because those cars were quietly removed before they could speak too loudly. The most dangerous E-Types did not fail publicly. They were simply deemed unacceptable, pushed aside without fanfare, and allowed to disappear. The legend, polished and romantic, stands on the absence of those cars as much as on the success of the ones that remained.
The hydraulic test fleet that preceded the production Citroën DS is one of the darkest and least romantic chapters in post-war automotive history, and it is almost entirely absent from the official legend. The DS is remembered today as a miracle of comfort, safety, and futuristic engineering, but that image only exists because the earliest versions were judged so dangerous that the French state refused to let them anywhere near the public. The car that became an icon was born from machines that actively tried to kill their drivers. Citroën's obsession with a fully integrated high-pressure hydraulic system was unprecedented. Suspension, braking, steering assistance, clutch operation, and ride height control were all tied together into one complex, centralized system running at extreme pressures. On paper, it was brilliant. In reality, the first generations of this system were terrifyingly unstable. Seals failed without warning. Pressure accumulators lost charge suddenly. Valves stuck open or closed. When something went wrong, it did not degrade gradually. It collapsed. Test drivers described incidents that sound almost surreal. At speed, the car could suddenly sink onto its bump stops as hydraulic pressure vanished, transforming a supple, floating ride into a rigid, skittering chassis with no suspension travel at all. Steering effort could spike instantly or disappear into numbness. Brakes, which relied entirely on hydraulic pressure rather than mechanical linkage, could go from powerful to non-existent in a heartbeat. There was no backup system in the earliest cars, no redundancy, no warning. One moment the DS felt like the future, the next it became an uncontrollable object sliding on rigid wheels. Even more alarming was how interconnected the failures were. A leak or pressure loss in one part of the system could cascade through the entire car. A minor seal failure could simultaneously affect ride height, braking performance, and steering feel. Drivers reported situations where the nose dipped violently, the rear squatted, the steering went vague, and the brake pedal turned rock hard or useless, all within seconds. At highway speeds, this was often unrecoverable. French authorities were fully aware of what was happening. These were not isolated test mishaps. Patterns emerged quickly. Government evaluators and transport officials observed the same failures repeated across multiple prototypes. The conclusion was blunt. The car in its current form was unfit for public roads. Approval was refused outright. There was no quiet conditional acceptance, no limited certification. The early DS hydraulic cars were simply banned from sale.
Citroën understood the stakes. The DS was not just another model, it was the company's technological future and national prestige project. A public scandal involving uncontrollable cars losing brakes and collapsing at speed would have destroyed the program and possibly the company itself. The response was ruthless and silent. Many early prototypes and test vehicles were dismantled or destroyed entirely. Records were buried. Drivers were reassigned. Failures were discussed internally, not publicly. The goal was not to defend the early system, but to erase it. Years of redesign followed. Materials changed. Seals were improved. Pressure regulation was refined. Redundancies were added. The braking system was reworked to behave more predictably. Ride height controls were stabilized. By the time the DS reached customers, it was still complex and still demanding careful maintenance, but it was no longer a sudden death machine. Crucially, it gained enough reliability that its benefits outweighed its risks. This long, dangerous gestation is why the DS feels so radical even today. Citroën did not iterate gently. It leapt forward and then paid the price privately until the leap could be made survivable. The cars that failed did so violently enough that the state intervened, and Citroën accepted that intervention rather than fight it. The legend of the DS as a safe, serene car is inseparable from the fact that the most dangerous versions were never allowed to exist in public memory. What is unsettling is how close history came to a different outcome. Had those early hydraulic cars reached customers, the DS might be remembered as a beautiful but lethal failure, a technological overreach that proved engineers could outrun safety itself. Instead, the public met only the refined survivor, not the unstable ancestors that made it possible. The smooth, controlled, almost magical DS that carried presidents and survived assassination attempts was built on prototypes that collapsed, slid, and failed without mercy. The legend stands not because the DS was perfect from the start, but because the worst versions were forbidden, erased, and sacrificed so the idea itself could live.
The Tatra 77 and 87 occupy a strange, almost uncomfortable place in automotive history because they represent genuine genius paired with an indifference to human limitation that borders on cruelty. These were not crude or poorly engineered cars. On the contrary, they were among the most advanced road vehicles of their era. Their danger did not come from incompetence, but from being too far ahead of the world they were unleashed into. When the Tatra 77 appeared in 1934, it might as well have arrived from another century. Streamlined bodywork shaped by wind tunnel testing, an air-cooled rear-mounted V8, independent suspension, and sustained high-speed capability that most contemporary cars could not approach even briefly. The later Tatra 87 refined the concept further, becoming lighter, faster, and even more aerodynamically efficient. On the open road, these cars could cruise at speeds that shattered expectations in the 1930s and 1940s. They were built to fly. The problem was that they flew on roads, tires, and driver skill sets that were utterly unprepared. The rear-mounted V8 placed enormous mass behind the rear axle. Combined with swing axle suspension, this created handling characteristics that were calm and stable in a straight line, yet terrifyingly unforgiving once the limit was crossed. There was almost no warning. Grip did not fade progressively, it disappeared. When it did, the heavy rear swung outward with enormous momentum, often faster than a human could countersteer or even understand what was happening. Contemporary drivers describe the sensation as the car suddenly deciding to go somewhere else entirely. At speed, especially on uneven or cambered roads, a slight misjudgment could provoke instant oversteer. Lift off the throttle at the wrong moment and weight transfer made it worse. Brake abruptly and the rear could step out violently. Once the swing began, the mass of the engine ensured that recovery was unlikely. Spins were rapid and severe. Rollovers were not uncommon. Survival depended more on luck than skill. During World War II, this danger took on a grimly ironic dimension.
German officers stationed in occupied Czechoslovakia frequently confiscated Tatra 87s, attracted by their speed, prestige, and futuristic appearance. Many of these officers were experienced drivers, accustomed to powerful vehicles. It did not matter. Accident reports mounted quickly. Officers crashed, sometimes fatally, often on open roads where no enemy action was involved. The cars gained a dark reputation within the Wehrmacht as uncontrollable and treacherous. Eventually, the situation became so severe that an unofficial but very real ban emerged. German command discouraged and in some cases outright prohibited officers from driving Tatras, not because they were slow, unreliable, or impractical, but because they were killing their own people. Few cars in history have earned such a reputation. Too dangerous for even confident, trained drivers operating in relatively unconstrained conditions. After the war, the reputation followed the cars into peacetime. In several countries, authorities quietly discouraged registration or imposed restrictions. Insurance companies were wary. Accident statistics told their own story. These were not beginners' cars, and they were not forgiving experts' cars either. They demanded constant respect, absolute smoothness, and an understanding of physics that most drivers simply did not possess. Even then, the margin for error was razor thin. Locals joked that the Tatras were faster than the roads, but this was not humor born of exaggeration. It was gallows humor. Roads of the era were narrow, uneven, poorly surfaced, and unpredictable. The Tatra 87 could sustain speeds that assumed modern infrastructure and modern safety margins. The car itself did not bend to the road. It imposed itself upon it. When the road failed to comply, the consequences were immediate and often final. What makes the Tatra 77 and 87 especially chilling is that they did exactly what they were designed to do. They were stable at speed, aerodynamically brilliant, mechanically robust, and astonishingly efficient. The danger lay in the transition between control and loss of control. There was no gradual conversation between driver and machine, only silence, followed by violence. Tatra never fully acknowledged this publicly. To do so would have meant admitting that their brilliance came at a human cost. Instead, the cars were framed as misunderstood, demanding, or suitable only for skilled drivers. History has softened their image, presenting them as misunderstood pioneers. In truth, they were pioneers that crossed into territory where technology outpaced both regulation and human reflex. The Tatra 77 and 87 were banned not by a single law or decree. They were banned by experience, by bodies, by whispered warnings, and by unofficial orders meant to stop the bleeding. They remain some of the most fascinating cars ever built precisely because they refused to compromise. They showed what was possible long before the world was ready, and in doing so, they punished mistakes with a severity few other road cars ever have. They were not evil machines. They were honest ones. And honesty, at that speed, with that layout, on those roads, was often lethal.
The Chevrolet Corvair Monza GT prototype is a singularly fascinating artifact of mid-1960s American automotive ambition, a car that occupies a space between visionary engineering and outright danger. Unlike most concept vehicles, which are primarily styling exercises or technology showcases with little regard for full operability, the Monza GT was fully functional. It could start, accelerate, brake, and corner like a real car, but that very functionality is what made it incompatible with public roads, regulatory frameworks, and the limits of human reflexes. Its story is one of potential and peril, of a car that might have redefined the American sports car had it not been so dangerously extreme that it could never legally exist outside the factory and test track. The Monza GT was conceived at a time when GM sought to explore the future of compact, high-performance vehicles. It was intended as a halo project, a glimpse of what a sophisticated, mid-engine American sports car could be, leveraging the Corvair's rear-engine architecture.
On paper, the design was brilliant. The car's body was low, aerodynamically sleek, and visually radical, hinting at European mid-engine supercars, yet maintaining an American sense of proportion and presence. But beneath the aluminum and glass lay a mechanical reality that was far less forgiving than its appearance suggested. At the heart of the Monza GT's problems was its layout. The rear-mounted mid-engine configuration placed most of the car's mass behind the driver, resulting in an extreme rear weight bias. Coupled with experimental suspension components derived from the Corvair's swing axle design, this produced a car that could be precise under controlled conditions, but utterly unpredictable when even a minor deviation occurred. Lift-off oversteer, already a concern in the production Corvair, was magnified dramatically in the Monza GT. Test drivers found that the car could transition from neutral handling to violent oversteer almost instantly, sometimes faster than a human could react, particularly during hard braking or evasive maneuvers. The rear could tuck sharply, sending the car into spins that felt instantaneous, creating an environment where the line between manageable excitement and catastrophe was paper-thin. Compounding this was the car's braking system. While technically competent for the era, the Monza GT's brakes were tuned for light track use and did not provide consistent feel under repeated heavy application. Hard stops could shift the car's balance abruptly, sending the rear around just when maximum stopping power was needed. Even in controlled test environments, engineers noted that the braking behavior was unpredictable. Pedal effort and deceleration rates could vary dramatically with temperature, tire condition, and road surface. On public roads, these instabilities would have been amplified, producing a car that could spin, collide, or roll over at any moment without warning. Occupant protection, or the lack thereof, was another critical issue. The Monza GT had almost no real-world crash structures. Its lightweight body, essential for performance, offered negligible energy absorption. There were no reinforced sills, no side impact structures, and minimal occupant restraint beyond standard seatbelts of the era. Even a minor impact at modest speed could have catastrophic consequences. The car was designed for controlled testing at dedicated facilities, not for interaction with everyday traffic, pedestrians, or roadside obstacles. Internal GM evaluations were blunt in their conclusions. Engineers recognized that the Monza GT's extreme dynamics and lack of protection were not just defects, they were intrinsic to the design. The car could not be made predictably safe without fundamentally changing its character. Modifying suspension geometry, adding weight, or stiffening the chassis would have undermined the performance and mid-engine balance that defined the prototype. Simply put, the Monza GT could never be legally homologated for public use, and attempting to do so would have been reckless. As a result, the Monza GT program was quietly dismantled. Most prototypes were destroyed to prevent their circulation, leaving only a single example preserved for posterity. GM never attempted federal approval, never sought exemptions, and never publicized the project's failure. To the public, the Monza GT simply never existed. To engineers and designers, it was a constant reminder of the thin line between audacious innovation and regulatory impossibility. The Monza GT's story is also instructive because it highlights the tension between aesthetic ambition and mechanical reality. Its low-slung, wedge-shaped profile, gull-wing-style doors, and mid-engine stance foreshadowed decades of exotic car design, influencing countless production and concept vehicles that followed. Yet its operational extremity ensured that it would remain a ghost, seen only in photographs, drawings, and one surviving example, rather than in the daily life of drivers on ordinary streets. Importantly, the Monza GT was not simply a difficult car. It was a car whose very existence was incompatible with public roads. Unlike the later mid-engine supercars that carefully balance performance and predictability, the Monza GT demanded skill, focus, and luck in equal measure. Even the most competent driver could not guarantee safety under normal road conditions. It was, in essence, a prototype so extreme that regulatory approval was a mathematical impossibility, a vehicle that was erased not because it lacked appeal, but because it could never coexist legally with everyday life.
The Auto Union Type C road experiments of the 1930s are an almost forgotten chapter in automotive history, a time when racing excess collided head-on with the limits of ordinary roads. The Type C Grand Prix car was already legendary, a mid-engine, rear-mounted V16 behemoth with supercharged power that could exceed 400 horsepower, a staggering figure for the era. On the track, it was a terror to competitors, precise when driven by a professional, but in the hands of anyone outside a closed circuit, it was a machine designed to punish mistakes brutally. Auto Union's brief flirtation with a road-going version was an experiment that authorities and engineers alike knew was doomed from the start. The idea seemed audacious: bring racing technology directly to public streets. The cars retained the rear-mounted, supercharged V16, a configuration that delivered monstrous torque instantly. Tires of the era, narrow, hard, and primitive, were completely incapable of coping with that power outside of smooth asphalt and controlled conditions. Heavy, unpredictable torque swings would send the rear end spinning, and with swing axle dynamics compounding by a mid-engine layout, any abrupt throttle change could turn the car into a violent, almost unmanageable missile. Liftoff oversteer was instantaneous. Under hard braking, weight transfer could provoke spins that no ordinary driver could control. Steering presented its own nightmare. It was heavy at low speed, yet inconsistent at higher velocities, leaving the driver with almost no meaningful feedback during critical moments. Brakes, mechanical and unassisted, faded within minutes under repeated effort. On smooth racetrack tarmac, a professional driver could anticipate these characteristics. On public roads, often cobbled, narrow, and shared with pedestrians, carts, and bicycles, the cars were pure hazards. The combination of high speed, inadequate stopping capability, and unrestrained power delivery made even modest testing extremely dangerous. Test drives produced alarming results. Some cars crashed outright, suffering structural damage or near total destruction. Drivers who survived spoke of cars that could flip, spin, or slide uncontrollably with frightening suddenness. There was no margin for error. Unlike modern supercars with predictable traction management, these machines punished instinctive inputs. Even the most skilled drivers from Auto Union's racing program struggled to maintain control on roads meant for ordinary traffic. Authorities did not wait for disaster to occur in public. Registration was refused outright. The cars were deemed entirely inappropriate for shared roads, and rightfully so. Germany's public streets in the 1930s were not engineered for 400 horsepower monsters capable of 175+ mile-per-hour speeds. Pedestrians, bicyclists, and horse-drawn carts were common. The very physics of the cars made them unsafe in that environment. To put a Type C on public roads was to invite catastrophe, not just for the driver, but for anyone nearby. Because of this, several prototypes and test vehicles were dismantled. Auto Union recognized the liability of having such machines exist outside the track. Storing them in workshops posed a danger. These cars were so powerful that a careless move could result in severe damage or injury. By destroying the experimental road versions, Auto Union both acknowledged their brilliance and mitigated the risk of catastrophic misuse. The story of the Type C road experiments underscores the tension between racing innovation and public safety. Auto Union's engineers were pushing the limits of automotive technology, but the laws of physics, material science, and human reaction times could not be bent to accommodate this ambition on ordinary streets. These cars were not simply dangerous, they were fundamentally incompatible with the environment they briefly touched.
In historical terms, the Type C road experiments were erased before they could make a mark. They left behind only photographs, sketches, and the memories of test drivers who understood the fine line between exhilaration and death. They serve as a cautionary tale. Innovation without context can be as lethal as it is brilliant. Unlike the racetrack, public roads demand predictability and safety, and the Type C, for all its genius, was incapable of providing either. Today, the legacy of the Auto Union Type C is celebrated for racing dominance, aerodynamic sophistication, and engineering audacity. What is less known and often forgotten is that its very DNA made any attempt at a road-going version a regulatory impossibility. These were not failures of design, they were successes pushed into an environment that could not survive them. The surviving images and stories of these machines capture a fleeting moment when automotive ambition collided directly with human and societal limitations, and the world wisely said, "Not here, not yet."
The Mercedes-Benz 300 SLR Uhlenhaut Coupe occupies a nearly sacred place in automotive history today, celebrated as a technological and aesthetic masterpiece. But beneath that aura lies a stark and rarely discussed truth. The Uhlenhaut Coupe was, in essence, a car that could never have been legally or safely driven on public roads. From its conception, it was designed for a singular purpose, Le Mans racing, and every element of the car's design reflected that. The road-going world was never meant to touch it, and in practical terms, it couldn't. The Uhlenhaut Coupe was effectively the ultimate realization of the W196 race car philosophy. It featured a race-tuned 3.0-liter straight-eight engine with desmodromic valves, producing power levels that demanded precision and constant attention. The exhaust note alone was overwhelming, so loud that any attempt at street use would have been intolerable for occupants and neighbors alike. The brakes were not designed for intermittent, forgiving civilian use. They were built for endurance racing, needing careful modulation and cooling to perform safely. On ordinary roads, this meant that any sustained stop-and-go or repeated braking could quickly overheat the system, dramatically reducing stopping power at critical moments. The chassis and body compounded the danger. The car's lightweight magnesium alloy body, chosen for ultimate performance, presented an extraordinary fire risk. Even minor accidents or sparks could ignite the material, producing fires that were difficult, sometimes impossible to control. Structural protection for occupants was minimal. The car had no crumple zones, no modern safety cage, and no meaningful side impact protection. Any collision, even at modest speeds, would have been extraordinarily hazardous. Internal Mercedes-Benz documentation from the era reflects the company's unease. Engineers expressed concerns that the car's extreme performance and minimal protection made it unsafe outside controlled circuits. They worried about liftoff oversteer, unpredictable handling at high speeds, and the absolute lack of margin for error on public streets. Before the 1955 Le Mans disaster, there were already private conversations in the company acknowledging that the Uhlenhaut Coupe could never pass civilian safety or durability standards. It was a brilliant car, but a fundamentally incompatible one for normal driving. The events of Le Mans in 1955 only cemented this reality. After the catastrophic accident at the 24 Hours race, European regulators made it unmistakably clear that vehicles derived from such extreme racing technology would never be tolerated on public roads. Any attempt to sell or even register a car like the Uhlenhaut Coupe would have been impossible. While the timing aligned with public safety concerns, Mercedes' own documents show that even without the disaster, the car was already effectively illegal. Its performance and construction were beyond what ordinary roads, ordinary tires, and ordinary humans could handle. Mercedes' response was quiet and deliberate.
The Uhlenhaut Coupe was not cancelled because it was too loud or too fast in marketing terms. It was effectively erased because acknowledging its true nature would have forced the company to confront the fact that it had built a car fundamentally incompatible with civilian life. Only a handful of prototypes were built. 2 survive today in museum collections, preserved as technical marvels rather than usable vehicles. Any further development or road attempts were shelved entirely. The car was hidden in plain sight, celebrated for beauty and technological audacity, while its operational reality, one that made it illegal, lethal, and impractical, remained invisible. In practice, the Uhlenhaut Coupe illustrates the tension between absolute engineering ambition and the limits imposed by physics, regulation, and human tolerance. Every corner, every brake application, every throttle input demanded the precision of a professional racer. On a public street, it would have been merciless, unforgiving, and deadly. Mercedes understood this and took steps to ensure that the car would exist only where it could be appreciated safely, behind museum glass, in private collections, and in historical memory. What makes the story remarkable is the selective preservation of reputation. The Uhlenhaut Coupe is remembered as a legend of performance and design, almost divine in its execution. But that myth is built upon a silent understanding. These were not cars meant for streets. They were too extreme to coexist with ordinary life, and Mercedes made the conscious choice to conceal that truth. The Uhlenhaut Coupe survives today as a miracle of engineering and aesthetics, but it also survives as a ghostly reminder that brilliance without restraint can never be democratized, and that some machines are simply too extreme to be allowed to drive among us.
The Tucker 48 is often remembered as a symbol of American ingenuity, a bold, futuristic car whose fate was sealed by corporate intrigue and political maneuvering. Yet beneath that narrative lies a more uncomfortable reality. The car, in its earliest production form, was fundamentally unready for the everyday demands of public roads. It was visionary in concept, astonishing in ambition, but dangerously unfinished in execution. A machine that flirted with legality and safety in ways that would be almost unimaginable today. The engineering of the Tucker 48 was radical for its time. The rear-mounted, air-cooled, helicopter-derived engine promised smoothness, torque, and compactness, allowing for a strikingly spacious and futuristic cabin. But the reality of that power plant in early production cars was far less elegant. The engine ran hot, often overheating during extended drives, and transferred excessive heat into the cabin. Components stressed under load would wear prematurely, and cooling systems were prone to failure under typical highway conditions. While it sounded impressive in demonstrations, in everyday use it was temperamental, demanding constant attention to oil, coolant, and operating conditions. Handling, too, presented significant challenges. Early cars suffered from unpredictable steering geometry. The combination of a rear-mounted engine, swing axle-inspired rear suspension, and flexible front suspension produced nervous, twitchy behavior at highway speeds. Test drivers frequently reported that the car could suddenly dart or weave when encountering minor bumps, camber changes, or abrupt maneuvers. The steering feedback was vague, leaving drivers unsure of the car's exact behavior until it was too late to react. Suspension flex compounded the problem. The chassis could twist under load, amplifying oversteer tendencies and creating a sensation that the car might spin or slide unpredictably during emergency maneuvers. Braking was another area of concern. The Tucker's mechanical and hydraulic brake system was uneven in performance. One stop might feel solid and controlled. The next, under similar conditions, the pedal might feel soft or fade unexpectedly. In a vehicle with a rear-mounted power plant and a long wheelbase, such inconsistency was not merely annoying, it was potentially catastrophic.
Engineers and early testers quickly realized that the car could not reliably decelerate under all conditions, especially when combined with its lively handling characteristics. Federal inspectors, when examining early production cars, were alarmed. Reports indicate that officials questioned whether the Tucker 48 could be permitted on public roads without significant redesign. It wasn't merely a question of emissions or minor safety tweaks. The vehicle's fundamental layout, suspension dynamics, and mechanical idiosyncrasies made it marginal at best. The car's very existence in traffic could pose a risk to both its occupants and other road users. When Tucker Motor Company collapsed under financial and political pressure, many of these early production cars were seized, dismantled, or otherwise disappeared from circulation. The surviving examples, later celebrated as museum pieces or collector's treasures, were never fully exposed to prolonged public use, which in many ways preserved their mythic status. They were not perfected by time or engineering, they were preserved by circumstance. The Tucker didn't simply fail in business, it was quietly judged unfit for continued road use in its initial form, a judgment overshadowed by the more sensational narrative of corporate sabotage. In retrospect, the Tucker 48 embodies a rare duality. It is both a technological marvel and a cautionary tale. Its design foresaw features that would become standard decades later, from safety innovations like a padded dashboard to the directional Cyclops center headlight, but it also exemplified the perils of pushing innovation too far, too fast, without the iterative refinement necessary to make a car safe for public roads. Early production cars existed in a liminal state, too advanced for their era, too volatile for ordinary drivers, and ultimately too fragile to survive without careful, controlled stewardship. Today, the Tucker 48 is celebrated not because it was perfected or even entirely safe, but because it survived at all. Its mythos rests on the tension between genius and danger, between visionary design and practical limitations. The early cars were dangerous, temperamental, and legally marginal. They were erased from the public stage not solely by corporate conspiracy, but because reality had already determined that these machines, as built, were unfit for the very roads they were meant to conquer. The Tucker didn't simply vanish, it was quietly excused from exposure, preserved as legend rather than tested as function, a car whose brilliance could only survive under the protective veil of history and museum display.